A few days ago, I asked my brother to do me a favor. I asked him to pose a question to his Amazon Echo. He asked, "Hey Alexa, is Amazon coming to Newark, New Jersey?" This was her dulcet-toned response. Amazon selected Arlington, Virginia as the location for its second headquarters. The company will invest more than $2.5 billion to create more than 25,000 jobs. In addition, Amazon selected Nashville for a new center of excellence for its operations business, which will create more than 5,000 jobs. Amazon will also continue to grow and hire across its 17 corporate offices and tech hubs across the US and Canada. Not quite the answer I was looking for. What was missing from that response was the fate of Amazon's bid to open a second headquarters in New York City. Last week, in a very subdued press release, Amazon announced that it would no longer pursue the construction of the second headquarters in New York City. All this came at the end of a year-long courtship between Amazon and several cities and states, including Newark and New Jersey, which submitted a joint bid, where cities competed to vie for Amazon's attention with tax incentives and, in some cases, colorful video presentations. Immediately after Amazon's announcement about New York, almost every media outlet offered its own autopsy of the situation. Some said that the push to prevent Amazon from establishing the new HQ arose from a groundswell of grassroots activism, primarily from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, and State Senator Michael Gianaris, who specifically decried the special tax incentives offered to Amazon, its anti-union stance, and its relationship with ICE, among other things. Others argued that these were merely the loudest voices in the room and didn't represent the views of actual New Yorkers on the ground, which some polls suggested were in favor of Amazon coming. Either way, within a few days, Mayor Baraka published a piece, not surprisingly, in the Washington Post, seeming to say that the administration wanted Newark to be in contention for the second HQ offered to Amazon. It's unclear whether Amazon is still searching to place this HQ after its experience with New York. To discuss Amazon, the abandonment of its plans to build a second headquarters in New York City, and what this means for Newark, are Christian Dean Smith, Rory McQueen, and George Santos. And I'm going to go around and have them introduce themselves. Rory?
Hi, my name is Rory McQueen. I currently work as a software engineer at Uber in New York City. Been living there for just over a year. Prior to that, I was living in a couple different places. I was in San Francisco for a while and then living abroad in Brazil for 2 years.
Christian?
Hi, my name is Christian Dean. I'm an engineer at a startup in New York. I'm originally from Newark, from Ivy Hill, and I lived in Seattle as well as Silicon Valley, working for Microsoft and other tech company, and look forward to speaking about Amazon's involvement in the tri-state area and the potential effects if it had landed in 2019.
Hi, I'm George Santos. I'm with the Newark Community Economic Development Corporation. We're the city's economic development corporation. I grew up in Elizabeth, right next door to Newark. My wife and I just bought a house in Forest Hill. And at NCEDC, we were part of the whole Amazon push for here in Newark.
Thanks. So I just want to start off with, I think starting off with New York would be a better place, and sort of understanding what the process was like, why Amazon initially chose New York, and why they then pulled out. And this is for anyone out there who wants to jump in and sort of explain what happened there.
I think at a high level, the selections of Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C., as well as New York City and an area adjacent to Manhattan were selections based on the booming market of talent and engineering talent specifically in both those metropolitan areas. Traditionally, or over the last few decades, I think Silicon Valley and then to a lesser extent Seattle, maybe Austin, have been associated with tech growth and tech talent in particular. And today, the highest percentage of available engineers or engineering talent is actually in New York City by volume, or the New York City metropolitan area. So that is a logical reason to select New York in particular, as well as the area outside DC. And then there's a lot of other speculation around why those two markets in particular might be attractive, especially to a company like Amazon that's that relies on shipping and just moving of processed goods internationally, being in proximity to two very large ports, but I'd say that that's the primary thing is just talent, and the average salary of the potential employees being so high, and having headquarters be specifically a place where people associated with decision making, as opposed to just sort of factory or warehouse jobs, is another reason to look at those two markets.
Right. So the political and the financial capitals of the U.S. and probably even the world, they basically set up outside those two.
So political capital. Could you tell me more about your thoughts on that?
So what I guess
Crystal City.
Yeah, Crystal City, but being so close to what? I mean, this is, I think, what kind of got me a little annoyed about when Amazon announced it was going to Long Island City. I kind of groaned, and I think a couple other people groaned, being like, it's just New York City. It's one stop off the F train, I think. And you're basically setting up in New York City. And with Crystal City, you're trying to set up in Washington, which it's very, very small. It's a square that's relatively confined, but you're trying to access the people that are already in Washington, D.C.
So I challenge that a little bit, especially on the Long Island City front, because especially as we start getting towards the Newark part of the conversation, it's just as easy to get back and forth from New York, from the Midtown or Lower Manhattan to Newark as it is to get over to LIC. Like getting on the E or the F train from somewhere in Lower Manhattan over to Queens is very similar to getting on the PATH or NJ Transit over to Newark. And yet those were two different contenders in the sweepstakes that they held. So I also think that part of the significance of the sort of blowback or the pushback for Amazon coming into New York City is the role that Queens and places like Long Island City have held and are kind of holding on to in a way in the New York financial and just working landscape. So Manhattan is already pretty much priced out most native New Yorkers or even a lot of New York transplants and the boroughs that are adjacent to it. And then if you want to include Jersey, you can. If you don't, you don't. But if you look at Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn, these are places where people can live and then still work in Manhattan and, make life work and make ends meet in a more reasonable way. And so as more and more, as those areas increase in price and places along certain train lines or along certain convenience stops get increasingly gentrified, prices of rent go up, and you start losing some of that housing inventory that could be a place for someone to live affordably and work and kind of make money in traditionally Manhattan, but I guess today also in economic centers that are in the boroughs, but sort of really centrally located. So you could work in Dumbo or downtown Brooklyn, or Long Island City already has a number of larger headquarters based. So adding more of that and taking away office and housing inventory that's affordable and kind of making it something more like a SoDo or South Lake Union in Seattle is part of the challenge. New York, I think, is big enough actually to absorb a good amount of it, and a lot more than I think some of the other contenders, including Newark, in my opinion. But it's I think a lot of that challenge is that if you shift Long Island City and places like Long Island City to being a tech campus, then it just pushes folks further out and then takes away more and more of the space where folks could live and work reasonably before.
Okay, so I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that we need to unpack in there, and I guess I want to take it a step back and look at the competition itself, and in New York in particular, which I found kind of amazing. I mean, obviously New York would want to be a place where Amazon could come, but Amazon was not the first game in town. I mean, most notably, Google was already there. They were setting up on what's called Silicon Alley, which I think is 6th or 7th Avenue in that area. And from what I know, and granted, I'm not as deeply versed in that process of Google coming, but there wasn't this giant, season of The Bachelor that occurred, right, with Google. They sort of said, we're out in the Bay Area.
Hunger Games to me.
Yeah, or the Hunger Games.
And that's normal, right? Like I think it helps to kind of step back for a minute and talk about like the spectacle that Amazon put on, which is like not normal for a big company to do. Like as you said, Google is expanding in New York, and there wasn't this big brouhaha about it. Apple is also planning to expand, both of which are like peer companies to Amazon, but they didn't put on this like national contest where different cities had to basically like beg them to come and set up shop there.
Yes,
and I think in particular a city like New York, which does have this clout, does have a lot of talent, doesn't need to lavish Amazon with all these tax breaks and direct cash grants just to bring them there.
George?
Just to push back a little bit, like it was a big spectacle across the country. I'll agree with that, but Amazon put out an RFP seeking another headquarters, and companies do that kind of stuff all the time. Like usually they're quiet about it, but they solicit bids from developers or cities all the time about like, we want to open another campus, another office. What do you have to offer? This was unusual because it was, I think, unprecedented in its size and investment amount. And I mean, you're right. A lot of jurisdictions across the country kind of lost their mind. Like, what did Tucson do? They sent a 20-foot cactus to Seattle. Like, that's kind of weird. But I'll defend Amazon a little bit in that they put out this RFP and then they just kind of kept quiet about it and just waited, and everybody else kind of lost their minds about it.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's what I totally saw. I think that the way I looked at it, Amazon, I mean, it was brilliant in the sense that it's set up the structure and let the sort of the cities and the jurisdictions fall in and play this game. And I'm wondering, is there a way to separate out those incentives which would be offered anyway to a Google or to a company that would maybe be more low-key about their move from this race to the bottom? Like, how much extra was Amazon able to get because it played this kind of game in the public space of saying we're doing this, as opposed to just simply approaching each town individually and being like, well, this is what we're getting from the others, or would this have happened anyway? And it's just more about that we all saw it instead of it being more in the
I think
background.
the other thing about it is that Amazon released a bunch of parameters that they had kind of a priori of what they wanted to see from a city, and it was something like had to have an international airport, had to have direct flights to Seattle, had to have a certain minimum population size. And that already ruled out a bunch of like, small like Midwest towns and other places that were initially trying to bid for Amazon to come. And I think also if you look at an interesting article which said, which predicted that Amazon was going to pick New York and Northern Virginia, and it was just based on where Jeff Bezos has his homes. Like he has homes in Seattle, New York, and DC. And so he was never going to go to like Arkansas or anywhere where he'd have to, take a flight back and forth home. And so I think, again, going back to my original point, I think New York didn't need to lavish as much as it did on Amazon, these tax breaks and stuff. I think it was already in a very strong position, given kind of its given the fact that it's like an economic powerhouse, given its location, given its talent pool, and everything. So kind of go to your point, I think they did squeeze more out of New York than they otherwise would have been able to get.
This is going to probably lead to disagreement because I think there's two sides forming here. One is saying they were too lavish, the other being like, no, this is actually reasonable, this is what's normally done. I guess I just want to run with the lavish side for 1 second. If it is so lavish, then why do it, right? If you're in New York City and you're like, we're the biggest game in town. If you don't come, oh, well, we'll move on, right? Like, we'll be fine. Why participate in the process? What incentives are there on the flip side for people like de Blasio, for Governor Cuomo, for other local politicians to participate in this game, which seemed to end up blowing up in their face at the end of the day?
Your answer is as good as mine. I'm not sure why they did that. I think they were just so desperate to get what would be a political victory, but didn't realize the strength of their negotiating position. From the get-go.
Okay. And also just on the Cuomo point, there's sort of internal like thoughts about that. I also feel like there's a Cuomo 2020 lurking out there somewhere, and that may have also been, I think, at least particularly with him, his idea of, getting Amazon in may have been part of a larger campaign. So, but with de Blasio, I don't know. I don't know what was going on there, given that his previous background, what he's spoken about. You were saying, Christian?
Oh, it's just, the name was going to be Bezos Cuomo, right?
Oh, is that really?
If they came to New York.
Oh, wow. Like the actual Bezos.
I think
Cuomo
that was
2020.
I think that was his joke throw-in equivalent to the cactus to Seattle.
Yeah. So from what we're getting here, we don't know why New York.
Well, I would say that whenever a jurisdiction is confronted with something like that, you kind of just got to put your best offer out there, because if you really want to land it, and you don't know if you're, let's like buying a house, right? You put your offer in, you don't know if you're overbidding over everyone else. The seller might accept your offer, and maybe you feel like a sucker because you offered too much money. You could have gotten it for cheaper.
Yeah, winner's curse.
Yeah, you just don't know. So you got to figure out what it's worth to you. If you're making a return on your investment, if you think it's going to benefit your community in the long run, put out your offer and see what happens.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Phil Murphy or Mayor Baraka. It was one of the two I heard in a public setting say it would be a crime if Newark didn't participate, or it would be malpractice. I think that was the word. If Newark didn't at least participate in the process when one of the two was getting pushback from a constituent about whether or not New Jersey or Newark should be even courting Amazon. And that was the response I kept hearing, was this sort of like, we have to because it's there. We can't not at least be part of the game and at least make it onto the list of 20. So that was my feeling.
And I think that's the nature of putting out a set of requirements as opposed to putting out a list of metropolitan areas or narrowing it down in the first place. Because I'm sure there was a short list that was, at the same time that they put out a list of requirements and left the RFP up to cities, which is just it's that part of it is even interesting in my mind. When I think of requests for proposals, I think about companies bidding on someone's business as opposed to a city bidding to offer a company tax incentives. But I think the point of that is to have as many people participate as possible and see who shocks you. I agree that it makes sense to participate, but I also agree that in the case of New York, the strength of positioning is something that probably wasn't fully, I don't know, they probably didn't get the leveling right. That said, of all the metropolitan areas and cities specifically in the U.S., there's not many that could easily have absorbed a $3 billion tax hit, and New York certainly could have, and still, I think, made money in tax revenue.
But to put a finer point on the shortlist thing, I keep wondering, it's a sort of like conspiracy theory, right, that Amazon already had the shortlist, right? And what it was doing was seeing if they put it out there to everyone, like make it, a sort of global game. Could they use that? I think this is what you were saying, right? Could they use that to then go back to the people they were already,
absolutely.
their top 10 and drive them down in price?
Right. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. We can't ever know that for certain, but if you're going to put together a list of criteria, you're going to obviously look into which markets you think are attractive and you think would make sense. So even on just an internal, only share within senior leadership at Amazon level, of course, there's going to be a short list. That it would be irresponsible not to have a list of potentially attractive markets.
Right. And I think this is where I disagreed a little bit with Mayor Baraka's Washington Post article of last week, where he said, it was a surprise that we made it onto the 20. I actually think Newark was a strong contender. I mean, whether it be the top 5 is a different story.
He was surprised. He said we surprised many.
Yeah, right. But that's like splitting hairs. I think like this idea of like surprise at Newark.
We were very confident.
No, and I'm saying that, and I think we shouldn't undersell Newark in that sense of like, is it an uphill battle? Of course, but whether or not we're surprised it would make the top 20, given that we are in northern Jersey, probably the most diverse place on this planet. Right, and like very attractive for a company that wants to look like they're rebuilding an area.
I gotta say, when we read the RFP, like we kind of sat back and we said, like, this sounds like it was written for Newark.
Really?
Like,
could you go more into that, actually?
Well, like the RFP, like in the metro with 1 million people, like Rory was saying, right? You had to be within 45 minutes of an airport. Downtown Newark is within 15 minutes of Newark Airport. Or you had to be within a mile or two of a major highway. We have 7 major highways that cut through Newark. The sites had to have transit. Downtown Newark is probably one of the most transit-rich areas outside New York City in the region. Yeah. Right between Penn Station and Broad Street Station, we have 6 NJ transit lines. We have 17 light rail stations, plus a 24-hour path access to Manhattan. It's just like, criteria after criteria. It sounded like it was written for us, and like we knew we had to compete and threw our hat in the ring. It was kind of funny. I was sitting at home having a little bit of coffee one morning, getting ready to go to work when I saw the New York Times article about HQ2. I sent an email to my boss, and I was like, "Oh, maybe we should consider, looking at this. Maybe it's a long shot." By the afternoon, it was all hands on deck. Everyone's kind of everyone's getting together. We're gonna figure out what we're gonna do about this, how we're gonna respond. It was funny, and getting on that short list, I think was a real validation for all the work everyone did here to kind of promote Newark and come together and really put our best foot forward. And we've gotten a lot of attention from other companies because of it. It was a great exercise for the city, and maybe we're still in contention now. We'll see what happens going forward. But even if we don't get Amazon, it was a great exercise for us, and it's going to be a great tool for attracting other headquarters and jobs to the city.
Yeah, that's actually kind of interesting. Like, you could basically go around and be like, "Look what Amazon missed out on. They made that mistake of not coming here." But I also wanted to go to this sort of question that's lying there. Then, if we did check off all these boxes, why didn't we get it in the end in the first go around? Why was it that they went with New York?
I mean, I can't answer
No, of
exactly
course,
why they went to New York. I would say they should have come to Newark. Like we were talking about absorption in the region, we can absorb many more jobs and people than most other places in the region, and definitely more than what's been going on in Seattle with the high housing prices. The city's population is still 100,000 people fewer than it was in 1980. So we can take on that housing. Downtown Newark, I mean, Manny, you live here on a Sunday. It's pretty quiet.
Yes.
After 7 p.m., it's still pretty quiet. And we have, about 1,500 units under construction right now across the city, and several, many thousands in the pipeline. But, it's still going to be a drop in the bucket to get back to where we used to be. So we can absorb it. We can be very intentional about it. And with all of these issues of gentrification, all these pressures that, communities like New York City have, we have the benefit of being a little bit later to the revitalization game and preparing for those issues, right? So the city passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance, right? When you get a tax abatement from the city, we want you to hire local Newarkers to fill those construction jobs. We're doing those kinds of policies to make sure that as we bring in, new people from outside the city who have money that are going to spend that money here, that some of that money makes its way into the pockets of the people that live here, and that the people who live here will be able to live here tomorrow. That's kind of top of mind of everything we do here in the city.
So for those inclusionary provisions, how much of that would have applied to an Amazon though? Because I think when people talk about the idea of Amazon coming in and the large number of the average salary being $150,000 is thrown out, and when you're talking about hiring local workers, and in the case of Newark, local Newarkers, I find it difficult to think that a high percentage of those $150,000 software engineer jobs would be local Newarkers.
So, a couple things with that. One, for the inclusionary housing, obviously a corporate headquarters doesn't have any housing, so that doesn't directly apply. But as developers want to build residential units, they would have to set aside 20% of those units to be income restricted units according to the whole HUD guidelines and everything like that.
In the building itself, or
in the building itself, the city's current ordinance does allow for a buyout. You really need to convince the city that you're going to buy out, and that would go in an affordable housing trust fund to go cycle into new units. But for the most part, the city's preference is that those units get built on site within the building, interspersed, like we have in the Haynes Building or One Theater Square or the Walker House, 540 Broad Street.
And are those income based?
Those are income based, yeah.
Okay.
They're because in order to finance them, there are state tax credits that go into it in order to help subsidize the lower rent.
Yeah.
So there's strong state guidelines on what those income limits are. They're set by the state. As far as the jobs, the inclusion, we can't force a company to hire local Newarkers to work in their company. We do it. We try to give you a tax credit. So what we do with a property tax abatement is when you build something, we want you to hire local contractors to help build your headquarters. And obviously we want you to hire local Newarkers as much as we can. And we've been working to create STEM programs and working with NJIT.
Yeah.
And no, not all 50,000 jobs would get filled by everyone with a Newark address, but we think a significant number of them could be, or that people would come to Newark to fill those jobs and become part of the community. Right? Newark isn't we're a very diverse community. There's people that come here from all over. Like, I wasn't originally born in Newark. I've only lived here 6 years, but I grew up right next door. Right? You just kind of want to bring everyone together kind of holistically like that.
So actually, I want to ask a quick mechanical question about the bidding process. When that happened, I know there was a heavy state involvement. I think it started, Christie was still governor at that point, which was the weirdest combination of people I ever saw on one stage was Christie, Booker, and Baraka all together. They're joined in hands and, ready to go.
Happy family.
Yeah, I know. But what was interestingly missing, at least in the public view, are the other. I mean, Newark is big, but it's also relatively small compared to other jurisdictions and other. For the largest city in the state, it's actually relatively small physically. Were towns like Belleville, Bloomfield, Montclair, Elizabeth, were they also involved with Newark's bid process?
No.
Okay.
No, not directly like that. And we know a few other communities in the state sent bids to the state. They wanted to be part of it. Camden, Jersey City, New Brunswick, I think Trenton. I'm not sure who else. I'm sure several others. The state decided that we had the best shot if the state kind of got behind one jurisdiction, and they chose Newark as the state's largest city, as the city with the city with the best transit access. For a whole host of reasons. We still have large developable parcels in downtown, a lot of surface parking lots that can accommodate giant towers. And they decided to get behind us. I think a few towns sent their proposals to Amazon anyway, from New Jersey. But
the rogue towns.
Yeah, a couple did. Amazon chose us because we made the most sense here in the state.
And just a quick, just because you mentioned it, it would be interesting to know. Did you get buy-in from those surface level parking lot people?
So it's floating out on the internet. You can see the sites that we had proposed as potential sites for Amazon. Obviously, the city doesn't own a whole lot of public land right in the downtown that we could have offered up. So we had to work with the private developer community. Most of the big developers in the city were, obviously willing to sell or rent or whatever private negotiation they would have to come up with to build something for Amazon.
Or if not, there's always eminent domain.
I guess that would have gotten expensive.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, you have to pay fair market value for that. But I mean, push comes to shove, you can force.
But and again, the private community, the institutions, the nonprofits, so they all kind of came together.
Yeah.
And you never. It's hard to get a bunch of developers to agree on anything and to start share information like that. But it was a good process.
Yeah. I just want to put a pin on this conversation, not to throw it off a little bit, but I want to leave that for the end about Newark specific. I just want to go back a little bit to New York to sort of flesh out the end of the story, because we talked about the bidding process. We talked about Amazon finally selecting Arlington, Northern Virginia, and New York in the form of Long Island City. Things go quiet for about 2-3 months? When did this happen? It was in December? I think it was a Christmas announcement, right?
Mm-hmm. It was
tail of November.
It was
November, okay.
It was right after Election Day.
Oh, it was right after Election Day. So that happens. Things go relatively quiet, at least in the blogosphere, the internet sphere. And then comes 2 weeks ago, and everything seems to be coming to a head at a moment. Do you guys have any comments about that story? Particularly, we have two New Yorkers in the room. What was going on the ground level, or was it completely? Did it seem like quiet to you, and then all of a sudden, pop, it disappeared?
Yeah, still from Newark.
Well, yes, yes. Identifies as a New Yorker, but works in. Identifies as a Newarker, but works in New York City.
No, I mean, and of many places.
Yeah.
I think people spoke. Amazon has been pretty publicly not in favor of its talent population organizing in unions, and the entire democratic machine of New York historically has been has always had a strong base of union power, kind of, and being just pro labor in general. So that was always going to be a conflict that I think if I'm someone that's working for New York State governance or city governance, that you would think that the company would just be able to work with local folks and local organizations and basically appease them by having STEM programs set up with schools or districts within the city, similar to what I know some of the newer companies work with NJIT and work with local charter schools to sort of essentially do their part to be a good corporate citizen. And Amazon, even thinking back to my time living in Seattle, is a bit here or there when it comes to that. When they've with their development in South Lake Union, it's not there's not necessarily this corporate idea that for each new development or each new building or each new 1,000 or few thousand workers that they bring into the city, that they need to do something to give back. And I think that contrasting to Seattle and contrasting to other smaller cities, organizers in New York just didn't necessarily need to take a back seat to that.
They are building, was it a 40,000 square foot homeless shelter attached to their new tower in Seattle?
Yeah.
Oh, Amazon is.
Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
But homelessness has also increased 4% in the last year.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's then
a huge
12,000
issue,
people out of a city of 750,000. So I don't want to say that they don't do any, they're not, that they're like a corporate terrible citizen. I don't want to say that. They're, obvious. Yes, you're correct. They spend a lot of money helping, but I do know what it's like kind of living in there and seeing just year after year and going back and visiting, seeing the city change, seeing homelessness be visibly an increasing issue in specifically San Francisco and Seattle, where the affordable rent and or the inclusionary rent is $1,500 if you make under, I think, 60K or something, or 61,000 I think in SF, and then 1,500 might be if you make under 55K in Seattle. And that's not, when I think about definitely Newark and then even thinking about Long Island City, that's those numbers don't add up for a lot of the people that are currently citizens of both.
Right.
And that's what, going back to your question about what's happened in the last 3 months in New York City, people realized that and people spoke up about it.
But that funny thing is, it wasn't like the official organs of New York City and New York State said no. It was Amazon itself, coming forward and saying we're no longer doing this. I mean, maybe it was leading there. I don't know.
As I understand it, the New York State Senate appointed someone to the board that would eventually have the final say on whether Amazon could come there. And
Right.
he was someone, Michael
Gennars,
who was
yeah.
known to be against the deal. So it effectively meant that it was off the table.
Yeah, so
and so Amazon kind of walked away rather than be pushed, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to put this in the website online as part of the show notes. But I think it was Vox pointed out that this was actually very similar to what occurred. If you guys remember this when we were very young, when the Jets were going to build the stadium on the west side.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then some point out this is exactly the same thing that happened where the New York State and New York City came together, put a bid, it was ready to go. And then one particular state senator was appointed to this board that's like very powerful about controlling, is it land use in particular or something like that? And I'll put the article online. It's very fascinating how similar these things came together. There was an announcement and then completely fell apart within a few months.
And just to go back to your original question about kind of what happened afterwards. So I think originally there was this elation of, we've won the bid for Amazon to come to New York City. But then I think people started reflecting, what did we actually win? I think it's worth remembering that even before this whole process, there was already a lot of resentment against Amazon as a company, even independent of this deal. And I think there are kind of two separate questions here. One is, do you want Amazon, period, to come to your city? And two, do you think this deal actually makes sense and is worth it? I think there are a lot of people that are kind of just against Amazon, period, because of its record, as you mentioned, being kind of anti-union. There's articles that came out about the horrible conditions in their warehouses of people kind of collapsing because of overheat, couldn't have bathroom breaks. I was reading something about how they kind of had to deal with government agencies, the CIA, to basically develop like facial recognition software that people were very concerned about those being used to fight crime. So I think Bernie Sanders and a few other senators in the U.S. Congress put together the Stop Bezos Act, which basically pointed out that I think something like a third of Amazon's warehouse workers are on food stamps, and so that the U.S. government is effectively already subsidizing Amazon's workforce. So I think there are already a lot of reasons why people were against Amazon, and those people just kind of became more emboldened by the fact that Amazon was coming to New York City, and the fact that the state was giving all these massive tax credits to them, and so it kind of then snowballed from there into kind of a rejection of the deal.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I think it's very easy, and I do this myself, to conflate general tech company coming to area and giving incentives, and Amazon in particular, which I think a lot of people have specific hangups. And it's very easy to say, look how many jobs that we're rejecting, and not realizing that there's that alternative argument that people are saying, well, we just don't want Amazon in particular, as opposed to, let's say with Google. I mean, Google has its own issues as well, but like I imagine the conversation would be different if it were Google putting out the similar kind of bid. But so I don't know. Does anyone have any other comments about the New York process, or do you want to move on to?
I think it's always worth it to just emphasize that I think it's about housing too. Like the affordability numbers and the idea that what would be considered a very high salary most places in the U.S. or something like twice the median of the U.S. salary becomes affordable housing in the cities where giant tech companies are most prominent and where Amazon itself has been most prominent, speaks to what could happen in a worst case in here in the tri-state as well. And, I think also when it comes to adding homeless shelters or trying to attack a homelessness issue after homelessness rises is commendable in one aspect or in one regard, but homelessness really stems from there not being affordable housing available more than anything. And so that's, I think, the biggest, rents is already increasing so much in New York City and it's the boroughs outside and adjacent to Manhattan. And it's already probably the city's largest major issue is like housing is on everyone's tongues and on everyone's minds and on voters' minds. And so bringing more of that and increasing that tension, I think would have been the biggest challenge.
So I want to go with something you mentioned. You said voters' minds, and this is the kind of thing I want to flesh out here of who did the actual, who was speaking and who wasn't. And this is where I think I'm touching a third rail here, but I'm going to bring it up. Was it just simply AOC, Janaris, and Johnson coming forward, and that was just a trifecta that could kill it? Or was there actually a groundswell that came up, and there were actual people who really didn't want Amazon to come, and there was actually, support on the ground? Or did one cause the other? I mean, I'm trying to parse that out a little bit and see who was that opposition coming from, or was it a bit of, I don't want to call it astroturfing because I wouldn't call that of those people astroturfers, but were they maybe speaking a little louder than what the actual, constituents of that they represent were feeling?
I think there was a significant base led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others that was against the deal. I would say, they were a vocal group, a vocal minority. But I don't think it's right to say that it was only those politicians. I think they did have support from people in the community in what they were saying.
Okay, so let's move the conversation back to Newark and whether or not Amazon is going to come to Newark now, whether or not it should. As I say this, we do have an Amazon or a Bezos-owned company. I don't know the structure, but
Amazon subsidiary.
Okay, so they actually are a subsidiary of Amazon itself.
Independent subsidiary, whatever the
but
terminology is.
They are connected to Amazon. They're already
And a
here.
large subsidiary, like $2 billion ARR.
I'm not sure what their annual revenue is. I know they have about 1,400 employees here in Newark.
Yeah. So we're talking about Audible, right? And the largest, I think, ebook seller, audiobook seller in the world. So what is it? Is what Mayor Baraka wrote, that op-ed, is that a formal invitation to come back and have Amazon reconsider? Is it part of a larger project?
Well, I think, if you read some of the articles that have come out since then, Aisha Glover, the former president from NCEDC and now to Newark Alliance, has said that, we never stop reaching out to Amazon and to New York City. Because we understand it's a lot for just LIC. We thought maybe we could spread it out a little bit because we are so close, geographically, so easy to get to. The tax credits are still available. The land is still available. We're still ready to talk if they want to build, this $2.5 billion, investment would be now all at once. We're still here. But again, this was going to be a 10-year play for them, right? They weren't going to drop 50,000 jobs in anywhere overnight, right? And it's going to take time, right? And when they're ready to grow, and when they're ready to look outside Crystal City and Nashville and Seattle and look at the other communities, we're still here. We'll be ready to accommodate them to grow these jobs or any other big corporate player, right? This isn't just about Amazon in particular for Newark, right? It's not like we're all having Amazon stock and can't wait for them to come here. We want to bring jobs and investment to the city, kind of jumpstart a lot of that. And again, like we said, grow in a very intentional, inclusive manner. And this was one way to kind of capture a large amount of investment.
And are there any other companies that we're thinking about? I understand that like this may be part of when I said a larger project, I meant like outside of Amazon. Do we know of any other companies that might be thinking about?
If I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Right, of course, yeah. As I ask it, I realize it's,
I mean, we do have Mars Wrigley is moving 500 jobs
Right,
to Newark, which is nice because they were founded here many years ago and then moved out to Hackettstown. Mars did, and so they're moving some jobs from Chicago, some jobs from Hackettstown, and creating some new jobs. And they're going to be right in the Ironside building by Prudential Center on Mulberry Commons. So that's exciting. But we always talk to different companies looking to relocate their headquarters here, and just try sell them on Newark, tell them why it's such a great idea to move here.
Wow. And I guess this would be punting it back to the other side. Like, do you think Amazon or other companies like that should come to Newark? I mean, let's separate out the baggage that Amazon brings with it, and just talking about general, not even a tech company, but like Mars Wrigley, I wouldn't consider. I'm sure they have tech operations,
Sure.
But when I think of them, I think of chocolate and gum. I don't think of like drones that may conquer us at some point.
That'd
in
be
the future.
weird.
I know, chocolate drones.
Never know.
You heard it here first. So like, what do you guys think about having a company that large come into a place like Newark, which is large but not that large?
So I think Newark's incredible for all the reasons that were listed in the Amazon proposal and then some. I was curious to ask earlier about how significant or insignificant the port of Newark or port of Newark and New York was.
I mean, the port is definitely an amazing asset for the city and for the region. I don't know how important the port itself is for a corporate headquarters. Because for distribution and everything, obviously it's critically important
For Amazon.
For Amazon, and I'm sure they would have used the port a bit, but again, we're mainly talking about like programmers and business guys, not so much people. Maybe they would have been a certain amount of logistics, and they needed to like go down to the port themselves. I'm not sure, but the port is obviously one of our bigger selling points when we try to attract people here, especially for like middle class industrial type jobs, which people kind of forget. Everything east of the turnpike, there's a big industrial section out by Doremus, which is pretty job intensive, and those are like middle class jobs. Working the middle class jobs.
Or just to make it more specific, we're talking like manufacturing. Are we talking about warehousing? Like when you're talking about the Doremus area?
I mean, it's both.
Okay.
There's a couple of companies that have moved out there in the last few years since I've been at NCEDC. HelloFresh, which is like a Blue Apron type company. They're big like New York Metro or like East Coast distribution centers out there. Fabuwood, which is a company that moved from Jersey City to build like a 1.1 million square foot like warehouse. They do cabinet assembly. Mm-hmm. So a lot of stuff comes over from China. They finish the cabinets. They ship them off to like I guess like Home Depot and other centers like that. And that's like 600 jobs. That's like 600 more jobs than we had before. And obviously, not all of those people live in the city limits, but some of them do, right? And they're paying payroll taxes and they're contributing to the economy of the city. And we want to keep growing things like that throughout the industrial area, and kind of capture all segments, right, of the labor force, right? We want to have the high tech jobs, we want to have the business jobs, we want to have the manufacturing jobs, we want to have the warehousing jobs. We want to be an inclusive city for everybody.
Right.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think in Seattle, Amazon started, and most of their offices for HQ are in South Lake Union, more industrial tech focused now. But they started off in SoDo or south of downtown, which is I guess South Lake Union at one point was very industrial too in that city, but SoDo in Seattle is extremely industrial even today, and there's tons of warehouses. And so if they came here, I'm sure there'd be some benefits to having the tech and sales powerhouse, sort of white-collared roles downtown Newark, and then being a 10-minute drive over to warehouses where they could, see what's most efficient, et cetera. But yeah, answering your original question about Newark's prominence or how great Newark would be for a potential company, I think port is a good, or a port city is a good analogy. If anyone's ever played Settlers of Catan,
Yes.
I look at it as a city that's between a dice roll of a 6 and a dice roll of an 8. If you look at Philadelphia and
Wait, that
New York
never
City,
happens in Catan. Can you ever have an 8 and a 6?
so if you have a
together?
port, you can have two different properties that
Yeah.
are high
I am not this
high
nerd.
value. So get deep nerding out. Basically, when you have New York City and Philadelphia, and those are very high chances good things happen. Then Newark is sandwiched in the middle, but also has some of its own strategic advantages over both, because the airport isn't necessarily inundated in the same way as the others, because it's this transit bridge between all of these places. It's frankly underappreciated in a lot of ways, and so there's some advantages there. So I think Newark's fantastic for a conglomerate to come, especially if, as George mentioned, they're willing to kind of collaborate and be inclusionary, or just be a corporate partner.
Yeah, Newark, the sheep port of the future, right?
Exactly.
So this actually is interesting. You mentioned inclusivity and, white collar workers, blue collar workers, and whether or not that distinction will matter in the future is an interesting question in its own right. But I'm wondering, whether or not we're caught in this sort of Tolstoyan wave of the history, or just like, is Newark going to change? Is that a good thing? Obviously better, much more economic stability, housing, and people being able to create their own lives here is great. But I'm wondering, when we bring a huge influx of what are probably going to be predominantly white tech workers, does Newark lose that
Yeah.
sort of appeal? I mean, not appeal, but the sort of soul that it has.
Yeah. I'd like to address that a little bit. I mean, cities are always changing, right? Like, Newark's always changing. Like, Newark was, a 19th century industrial powerhouse with tanneries, and then we became this, city of 500,000 people, and, we had obviously a large influx of African Americans with the Great Migration, and then with white flight, the city became majority minority, and, even different neighborhoods. The Ironbound was first mainly Italian, and now it's Portuguese, but we don't lament that it's not Italian anymore. Like, it's fine. Like, things change. What's important is that things change, I guess, like, naturally, right? You don't want to force anyone to leave or to disrupt their lives. If somebody wants to move out because they have a better opportunity or move somewhere else, like, that's fine, right? People are going to do that. You just need to make sure that, we protect the people who are here now. Like, the city's always going to change. Like, we're down from our peak population. We want to grow back up again. We want to become more economically powerful. We want a lot of the vacant buildings on Broad Market to be occupied again. That's not a bad thing if that happens, right? Like, we can't. I feel like everyone kind of goes back to when they were in their early 20s and wherever they lived. Like, New York City was so great in the 70s, people in the 50s say, right? Because, like, it's when they were young and, like, experiencing the city, right? And I'm sure you talk to other people now, and they're like, oh, the 90s was so great in New York, and it's so different now.
Right.
And 50 years from now, people are going to be saying the same thing about right now, right? Like, things change, and that's fine. You just need to make sure that there's no negative effects to actual people's lives as the change occurs. And that's the important thing.
In general, or specifically to Newarkers that are already here?
I mean, in general, everywhere, but, like, definitely for Newarkers who are here, right? Like, you live in your house, you have your social network, you have your job, you have all that kind of stuff. If you're forced to be uprooted from that and have to move miles away, that's like a huge social cost to somebody, right? That's like, tremendous amount of social capital that you lose. Maybe you had a friend down the street that was like your babysitter for free, and now you don't have that anymore. And, like, so all of a sudden life gets much more harder. You need to protect those kinds of people to make sure they can keep that kind of network, keep that in their lives.
Yeah, I keep wondering if we're going to have our Brooklyn moment, and, like, whether or not we'll become, or I guess a better analogy will be Jersey City or Hoboken, where it's unrecognizable, but I think it still has that ghost there.
Yeah, again, Newark is small, but we're still a city of neighborhoods. And mainly when we're talking about the change, we're really talking about, like, downtown and, probably a significant part of the Ironbound just because of its proximity to Penn Station. We fully expect
Central Ward.
Yeah, but, like, Central Ward down to Springfield Avenue is going to take a little bit longer probably to see that kind of investment rather than, well, I mean, Queen Latifah's building some units down there.
I was going to say, like,
I'll take that back.
The great developer. Forget about Amazon. Queen Latifah Incorporated.
Shack Theater got in there early.
But But yeah, downtown, like, we want to see more towers, we want to see more people, we want to see more retail, and that's fine, like, as long as, again, like the mom and pop shops that are here now stay open, as long as the people that live here now get to live here and enjoy those jobs and get to shop at those new retail and get to be part of the fabric of the city.
Yeah, I wonder if I'll just flee to Northward once everything changes irreparably downtown and be like, my old Newark, I still have it up here.
Yeah, and I agree that it's a city of neighborhoods. I think the city, Newark, and its history has kind of protected itself from a lot of outside interruption and then sort of external disruption of its power being consolidated and just protectivist within the city, for worse and better at times. I think the last decade and a half, maybe, or just decade, has been probably the first time in many years that a lot of companies and outside forces have felt comfortable coming into the city, and that's why our downtown looks so different today than it did when either of us were growing up, and probably when you were growing up, here as well. But like it's I don't know how many cities in America have had a minority mayor, black mayor, since the 70s. Right. I don't know how many cities in America have. Even looking around this room and just think that people on the podcast listening can't see what's in this room right now. But there's just a lot of history that's from the pictures in the room are basically collections of folks from the African American diaspora that have been impactful in some way. And it reflects the energy of the space and also just the town that I do think there's a spirit of the city that does matter. And looking at cities like Seattle that at one point were 20% African American and now it's 2 to 4, and San Francisco it's very similar. That's what and then knowing that historically folks from Newark and we're going back and forth to Seattle and San Francisco and collaborating with thinkers and activists there and seeing what those places have become today. That's when I think about including, again, for worse and better, even our mayor's father. That's when I think about Newark meaning something just as a brand, as an idea, as a concept. And I do want to hold on to that while, yes, having opportunity, because it does make a difference when you're in school here and you see that you could go make 100, 200 grand right down the street in Newark at Audible. There wasn't Audible when we were growing up here either. So that matters, but that spirit of the city matters as well. And being a place not just for that African-American tradition, but as a place where immigrants and populations from the world over could come and make a landing. It's still a place, especially when you think of the East Ward and Ironbound, where people can come and sort of be their landing spot in America. And that's been a huge part of the tradition of this city. And if we could keep that while having, a golden white collar possibility available, that's what I would want to see for Newark.
So it's funny you mentioned that. This is something that like sort of is in the dark recesses of my brain, but like does Newark stop becoming an immigrant city?
No.
When we start having those companies come in? I mean, when I think of immigrant city, I mean, obviously New Jersey's been a hub for high skilled immigrants for the last 30, 40 years, but the sort of low skilled, a lot of them end up being undocumented workers. Obviously, they'll always be there. There always will be a population, but will it stop being a good 1/3, of the population? Is that part going to change? Which I think was always constant, at least, even back to the era of the tanneries with all the Germans and the Scots coming in.
I think as long as immigrants are coming into the United States, Newark is going to be a landing spot for them. Mm-hmm. I mean, the communities are here, right? And people join these communities. I mean, that's why your family came here. That's why my family came here. Is to be comfortable with those people. And even if 100,000 more people were to move into the downtown Newark tomorrow, and they were all white, the city was this, which is not going to happen, right? It's just not going to happen with just the demographics of the country are just changing, right? But even if that were, but even if that were to happen, the city would go from 50 to 40% African American. Right? The city is half African American. That tradition is always going to be here. Obviously, you still need to protect it. You should always be vigilant. It's a very important tradition to protect. I completely agree with you on that. But I think just the way Newark develops, it wants to see the development. I'm talking about like, I think regular people on the street. Like, I think most people have positive feelings when they see the towers go up and the new developments
Yeah.
and shops reopen, and they want to be a part of it, right? I know I remember like when Whole Foods opened, there wasn't a outcry, oh no, this is the harbinger of gentrification. It was more like, well, it's about time that we got a Whole Foods like grocery store in
Yeah.
downtown
Yeah.
Newark.
Yeah.
Like, I want to shop there. And if you go shop at that Whole Foods, the people that work there, the people that shop there look like a cross section of the city.
Yeah.
No, it's always amazing to walk in that Whole Foods and just see who's getting like a full, cartload of groceries and like just the amount of different people that are there. It just blows my mind. But I keep wondering like how much destruction will there be of, because we talk about new buildings and stuff like that, but are we going to lose a lot of those cool buildings downtown because they don't fit that model of what we're looking for when a big tech company comes in or a big company?
So I don't want to get it twisted. Like this is a very diverse panel. Like all four of us are like diverse in a way, and all of us, people that look like us and are from backgrounds like us, shop at Whole Foods too.
Yeah.
I think that's something that people get mixed up when they think about gentrification of areas. Like there's a range of economic classes and a range of just sort of where people are at in their life for folks from every diverse ethnic and cultural background. That said, when it comes to Newark always being a place where people can land, I do question that if the one bedroom becomes $1,500, as opposed to $1,500 right now, you could rent an entire house in the west or central and part of the east. Like every ward in the city, there's still places.
And and that's why, I mean, again, like there are going to be different pressures on different neighborhoods, right? And calling out the Ironbound and downtown for some of those like smaller market rate units, and that's why things like inclusionary zoning are important. I mean, part of the reason is just that construction's expensive, and like when you're in a region with a housing boom, like the New York metro region, I think construction costs have gone up by like a third in the last few years. So that makes projects more expensive. And if you can't, right, if you're building a tower in, let's say, Jersey City versus Newark, you're paying the carpenter the same amount of money, right, to like work both projects, but you're getting like twice the rent in Jersey City
Already.
right? So like, but
Whereas
your
yours-
costs are the same. So that affects a lot of things. And like just, I mean, that's the thing. Like new housing is more expensive. Like you got more, health and safety codes you need to follow, all that kind of stuff.
What are your thoughts on just the kind of renovation or refurbishing of a lot of the rich housing inventory we already have? Like the South Ward, there's these brownstones and mansions essentially that are the same, were built the same time and built with the same material as $1 million brownstones in Harlem or Brooklyn or Manhattan. And they're just, the prices are already going up a lot, and as I'm sure some of us have seen, but it's still more speculative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to get into
Fair enough.
flippers and that kind of stuff, but like, I mean, I live in Forest Hill, and I live in one of the more modest homes, I guess, in Forest Hill, but it's still pretty big, especially for
Yeah.
me, coming from like a tiny one-bedroom apartment in the Ironbound where our living room was about a foot wider than our couch.
Yeah.
And we moved out when our baby was, 3 months old, and it was starting to get really cramped. But like Forest Hill, like it's amazing. Like it's these giant homes, and some of them are absolutely immaculate. But every once in a while, there's a house that's been vacant for like 5 years, and there's still like investment that needs to come in there. And these are houses that, right, like some of them, at least this one, I can afford. If that house was in South Orange,
Yeah.
I would not be buying that house. That'd be $1.5 million house, $2 million house. I just
Double the
couldn't-
price of Montclair from there, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
oh my God.
It's so you want to see people move into these houses and restore them and bring them back, and put their financial equity and sweat equity into maintaining property in the neighborhood. That's we shouldn't think that's a bad thing. But you're right. Like affordability is always going to be an issue, and this again, the administration's here in Newark is trying to take steps to combat that and trying to get ahead of it, whether it's inclusionary zoning or like the city's trying to build 27 units of affordable housing on Clinton Avenue, on the Knoll Bank building, Clinton and Chadwick. We're taking steps like that to try to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, just want to open up to any last comments that our guests have, or any last questions or thoughts on Amazon in general, about Newark changing, and any businesses coming down here. If there's any last points people want to bring up. If not, so I'll wrap up the podcast. That's it for this episode. I'd like to thank our guests, Rory, Christian, and George. This is Manny Antunes, host and producer of the Pod and Market podcast. Editing and sound engineering by Phrase. Podcast logo and design provided by Robert Conti. Additional creative input by Samantha Cateas. If you have a subject you would like to hear discussed on the podcast, please email podandmarket@gmail.com or contact the pod through social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I would like to end a quote from one of my favorite books, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. CT had taken down Incondensa's founding motto, Te occidere possunt sed te edere non possit nefas est, which roughly translates to, they can kill you, but the legalities of eating you are quite a bit dicier. Thank you. Have a good weekend.